Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number 4.
In answering this question, together with number 11, I hope, Mr. Speaker, you will allow me to formally welcome the new Shadow Secretary. 12. Then you will allow me to formally welcome the new Shadow Secretary and her team, and regret the removal of their mainstream moderate predecessors, the honourable members for Garston and Halewood and North Durham. In recent weeks, Kurdish forces have recaptured Sinjar, and the Iraqi army are clearing the last pockets of Daesh resistance in Ramadi. In Syria, anti-Daesh forces have captured the Tishreen Dam east of Raqqa. Airstrikes, including those by the United Kingdom, have also inflicted significant damage on Daesh's illicit oil industry, reducing its revenues by around 10%.
Mr. Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will welcome what the Secretary of State had to say about the progress taken so far. Can you just outline to the House whether he considers there are any other measures necessary to put in place to ensure that all the members of the coalition can intensify their efforts against Daesh?
Well, on Wednesday, I will be meeting my counterparts from Australia, Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands and the United States to review the overall direction of the counter-Daesh campaign. We've made some good headway in both Iraq and Syria in recent weeks, but now is the time to discuss how to maximise the coalition effort and how to exploit the opportunities that now arise from the setbacks that Daesh has suffered.
Tulip Siddiq.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A major contributor to Daesh activities and capabilities on the ground is the foreign funding that it receives. Will the Minister outline what measures the UK is taking to curb the foreign funding Islamist groups like Daesh receive? In particular, what pressure is he putting on Saudi Arabia and Qatar?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable member, and this is one of the keys to Daesh's survival, and it is very important that we maximise our efforts to cut off its sources of revenue, whether they are internal, its access to oil revenues and the taxes it imposes inside Syria and in Mosul, or indeed external, the flows that she's described. And that is something we'll be discussing in a wider meeting with all members of the coalition, including the countries that she has mentioned, in a wider meeting later on.
Mr. Keith Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will be aware that there have been suggestions that as part of the way of constraining Daesh is to use backdoor diplomacy. Does he agree with me that the Canon Andrew White of Baghdad, when he said in an interview on Saturday, quote, "You can't negotiate with them. I have never said that about another group of people. These are really so different, so extreme, so radical, so evil." Does that not put into context the suggestion by the Leader of the Opposition?
I was very surprised, like my honourable friend, to hear the suggestion that somehow one could negotiate with the Daesh, or indeed that the Daesh had some, and I quote, strong points. The strong points, I think the House will recall, are beheading its opponents, burning prisoners alive, throwing gays off buildings, enslaving young women, murdering innocent British tourists in Tunisia, and slaughtering young people on a night out in Paris. I fail to see any particular attraction.
Mr. David Hanson.
Well, I don't think the Daesh have any strong points for the Secretary of State's benefit, but I would also argue with him that the Prime Minister's central argument was there were 70,000 so-called freedom fighters ready to take on the ground in Syria. On Tuesday, there's a liaison committee, the Prime Minister still couldn't defend that figure. Could the Secretary of State today?
Well, yes, I can, because it is not my figure or the Prime Minister's figure. It's an assessment produced by the Joint Intelligence Committee and independently of government ministers. And I would say gently to the honourable member, if he doesn't think there are so many freedom fighters in Syria, how does he think the civil war there, given the Syrian army is over 200,000 strong, how does he think that civil war has lasted for 5 years? There are people who've been fighting the Assad regime.
Mr. Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that a significant assault by ground forces, preferably of local troops, is the only way to deal with Daesh in the longer term?
Well, yes. In the end, Daesh will only be prized out of cities like Mosul in Iraq or Raqqa in Syria by local forces. Now, we've already seen some success in the recovery of Beji and Ramadi in Iraq, and I hope eventually other cities along the Tigris and the Euphrates, and I hope in the fullness of time we'll see similar action in Raqqa. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be getting on now with a full deployment of airstrikes to deal with the infrastructure that supports the Daesh.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And may I too welcome the Honourable Lady, the Member for Islington and South Finsbury, to her place and wish her well in her new post. I know there are important areas of defence in which we are in agreement, and I look forward to working with her and her team constructively over the coming years. Could I ask the Secretary of State, does he agree with the Prime Minister, who told the Liaison Committee last week that in the case of civilian casualties that, and I quote, "If people make allegations, we must look at them"?
Well, let me just say to the honourable member that we do an assessment after every British strike of the damage that has been caused and check very carefully whether there are likely to have been casualties, and that, of course, is taken into account in planning and approving the strike at the first place. It so happens that in the first year and a bit of operations, we're not aware of any civilian casualties so far in our strikes in Iraq or indeed more recently in Syria. But these are military operations. We do everything possible to reduce the risk of civilian casualties. It's not possible to eliminate it entirely.
I thank the Secretary of State for that answer, but can he confirm, therefore, that the Ministry of Defence will now accept evidence of civilian deaths from other sources out with UK military personnel and local forces that are deemed friendly? And can he assure the House that the evidence from highly credible organisations such as the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, Air Wars and the White Helmets, groups who are working on the ground and who very often are the first people on the scene, will be considered when calculating civilian deaths in the future?
Well, let me assure the honourable member that we will, of course, look at any evidence brought forward in open source reporting by other organisations in the assessment we make of each of the strikes in which our aircraft are involved. I have replied directly to one of the organisations he's mentioned, Air Wars, replying to them and pointing out to them that there is no particular evidence to back up the assessment they've made in that particular case.
Thank you, Speaker. Could my right honourable friend possibly give the House an update on the military and non-military support that is now being provided to opposition fighters in Syria?
Well, we are supplying, along with other countries, we've been supplying non-lethal equipment to those fighters, and we played a part in the initial training programme that was organised by the United States, and we are ready to do so as well. And in addition to that, of course, we are working with these groups on the route to a political settlement in the talks that have now been now got underway under the so-called Vienna process.
Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin by thanking the right honourable gentleman for his generous welcome to this job, and the honourable member for Argyll and Bute. The right honourable gentleman has the honour of having perhaps the best job in Westminster. Mine is the second best. Hopefully, we will change roles fairly soon. He can be assured that there will be difficult questions asked, and we will be hoping to work with the government where we can for the sake of the security of people in Britain. Senior military personnel have repeatedly warned that the RAF has been at full stretch, and that was even before the airstrikes on Daesh began in Syria. A squadron of F-35s has only just been ordered, but these won't come into service for several years, and so in the meantime the air campaign against Daesh will be dependent on 40-year-old aircraft. Can the Minister tell us how long he believes the air campaign can safely be maintained, and what would happen if a new threat was to emerge? Would the RAF have capacity for any further operations further than those to which the government already committed them?
Well, let me thank the honourable lady for her initial remarks and note her ambition to move from that side of the House to this side of the House, presumably shared by the two previous Shadow Defence Secretaries that I've so far come across. And let me just say to her very gently that a defence policy of nuclear submarines with no nuclear weapons, that thinks that Daesh have strong points and wants to end the Falkland Islanders' right to self-determination, may be Labour's defence policy, but it will never be Britain's defence policy. In respect of her particular question, the RAF are deploying a range of aircraft on Operation Shader in the Middle East, including modern Typhoons and unmanned aircraft alongside the Tornadoes that she refers to, and I can confirm to her that the RAF are well able to sustain this effort.
Michael Fabricant.
Question 5, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the nuclear deterrent is the cornerstone of the UK's defence and security policy. Maintaining continuous at-sea deterrence requires 4 ballistic nuclear submarines, and the UK's defence nuclear enterprise is gearing up to deliver the Successor replacement to the Vanguard-class submarines. These will not only keep Britain safe, but also support over 30,000 jobs across the UK, in England and Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and they make a significant contribution to the UK economy.
Fabricant.
30,000 jobs. I thank my honourable friend for his answer. Now, notwithstanding proposals for nuclear missile boats or submarines without nuclear missiles, does he not accept there are something like 17,000 nuclear warheads around the world, possibly threatening us, some of them? So what is my honourable friend's assessment of the likely risk to national security should the 4 missile submarines not proceed?
Well, my honourable friend is quite right to highlight the importance of the deterrent to our national security. We have seen, I think he was referring to comments over the last 24 hours, the most extraordinary contortion emerging from the champagne socialist salons of Islington. The idea that spending tens of billions of pounds to build but not arm a strategic deterrent betrays the new kind of politics from the Labour leadership, a lurch back to the discredited unilateralism of the 1970s, a breathtaking lack of understanding of how to keep this country safe, and the consequent threats both to national security and to tens of thousands of jobs across the UK.
Kevin Jones.
Would the Minister agree that it's not just about the number of jobs involved in the Successor programme, but the high-skilled nature of those jobs? Despite ill-informed comments from my own party at the weekend with regard to these jobs, would he also agree with me that simply you cannot turn them on and off like a tap when you need them?
I'd like to add my tribute to the stalwart work of the Honourable Member for Durham in his position both on these benches when he was a Defence Minister and on those benches when he was a shadow, and it's a sorry state to see him sitting right at the back of the backbenches today. He is, of course, quite right to point out that this is a long-term endeavour. To design and build a nuclear-enabled submarine takes decades. This is a 35-year project from initial conception to commissioning. And those skills are not only take a long time to develop, they can't be switched on and off, and they are at the very forefront of engineering capability in this country. Building a nuclear submarine is more difficult than sending a man to the moon.
Baron Davis.
Mr. Speaker, in light of these astonishing comments yesterday by the Leader of the Opposition having a submarine-based nuclear deterrent without actually having any deterrent involved, does my right honourable friend agree with me that in an increasingly uncertain world, that it is crucial that the decades-long held consensus on our nuclear deterrent is continued?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the considered way in which he made the point that this House is here to deliver national security to the United Kingdom as a whole, and it's in all of our interests to share a common objective to maintain the cornerstone of our defence, a continuous at-sea deterrence posture, and we very much hope that as many colleagues from across the House, when it comes to a vote, will be able to recognise consensus on this issue.
Moon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The replacement of the nuclear deterrent is, of course, a sovereign decision of the United Kingdom and its Parliament. However, it has repercussions across NATO should we decide not to proceed. Would the Minister tell us what he feels the repercussions would be for NATO and Britain's standing within NATO should we decide not to go to Main Gate?
Our deterrent is a NATO asset. So the NATO alliance depends in part on our ability to make that asset available should the need arise. So there is a very intense interest in the deliberations in this House being taken by our NATO allies, and I think she's quite right to highlight that.
Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister agree with me that all NATO countries are part of the NATO nuclear alliance, which is based on the three members who are in possession of weapons, and that to spend all the money to have a nuclear deterrent but to not actually have one at the end of it would be the worst option of all?
Well, I've already indicated that I think it's completely farcical to spend tens of billions of pounds on a weapon that can never be used and therefore can never fulfil the deterrent object that it has. So I completely agree with my honourable friend.
Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In what circumstances does he intend to use nuclear deterrent?
I think this gets to the heart of the confusion that lies at the centre of the Scottish nationalist policy. The deterrent has been in use every single day for the last 53 years.